So this is a Kickstarter preview, actually, for 1918 Brother Against Brother. And I have to say, they did a full box for it. This is the preview kit they gave me. Really, really high quality for a preview kit. At first I thought, other than the rule book that has draft on it, right? And it's kind of a, but other than that, I thought I had, a finished copy. We have real mounted counters, hard board actually, which I totally wasn't expecting. Some nice player aids. But in these days, I guess it's more possible to do tiny runs or something. But still, very, very impressive for a preview copy. So you get an idea that if they're willing to put this much effort into the preview copy, you're going to get something at least as nice, in terms of quality from the Kickstarter copy. Yeah. I don't do a lot of Kickstarter previews or really requested reviews of any kind. Strangely, for good reason, right? If you're familiar with my videos, you can see why people might be a little hesitant to do so. Strangely enough, I got like 2 requests, one on top of the other, and one of them I had to cancel. I'm not going to have the time to do it. But this one, I was excited enough about it because it's clearly a military game. It's a card-driven game on the Finnish Revolution. After, World War I, where the Russians lost Finland, basically, there is some possibility, that the Red Russians can hold it here. Probably not. Nothing to do with the balance of the game. The situation is skewed against them, where it's an unlikely result, but they can still win the game within it. And this one is based on kind of the Paths of Glory style of CDG, where you'll see why, but the activation points allow you to activate spaces, and then you get to move your units from those spaces and attack with them loosely. It's not as complex a game as Paths of Glory. We're looking at, they manage 15 pages of rules, including examples, scenario, all that. There's only one scenario. And it's only, 5, they call them rounds, but essentially 5 turns under normal parlance game. And it's got some interesting little ideas behind it. So let's take a look at what the rules are like, and then we'll get into playing. Now, one thing, this isn't going to go up until January 30th. I think, or after January 30th, I don't remember which, but they requested that I hold off on it. So I'll be doing this before that, and then it'll come out kind of quickly. I expect this won't take too long to actually play, depending on, my timing. All right. So the initial setup is handled by this card. I want to touch on one of the reasons I was asked to do this was actually the initial reason was, hey, we'd like to get your input on the game. And I'm like, well, I'll do my full video thing, and you can take advice as you like from that if you want, but I can't just review it, look at the rules and setup of a game and give commentary on it. So whatever I'm giving, there might be some impact on what the final game is. Might not. We'll see. I'm not going to be, play testing it extensively. I tried to convince my wife, but she's gotten into not really doing war games, so I couldn't get her into it. So let's see. You have your initial setup here, and I want to talk about this a little bit because the names, very few of us, I think, are familiar with Finland's geography terribly well. And I'm not quite sure what might help here, but some kind of lettering and numbering system to help find the locations would be helpful in setup. Necessary? No, there's, it's not that much, and you can hunt around. There aren't that many spaces, but it definitely would help. Now, the game's actually published in English and Finnish at the same time. So like the card deck, you'll be getting cards in both. There's going to be a Finnish rule book. They didn't produce that for me, which is fine. I can't read Finnish. So this tells you where you set up your pieces, and you got, you know, the number of units in each space. The halves indicate a damaged unit. Now, one of the next things, the game board description in the rulebook, it's perfectly fine for the most part, but it's the only place where this dotted line discusses who owns what that they don't have counters in. So at least, yeah, maybe down here at the arm. No. So a couple of these places, the only place you're going to find in this rule set where to put those control markers, and that's what they are, which look a little too large. I would suggest they go with a smaller size, is in this little section. I would suggest here that it get put into either the setup section or into the setup on the player aid card, just as another place to remember, so you don't have to try to find it. I had to spend a little bit of time trying to find it. Your cards are your standard CDG style cards with an action point allowance and an event on them. Some of the events are one time only, and those will be marked with an asterisk. What's interesting about these cards, and this is a mechanism I haven't seen before, I don't know if it's been done elsewhere, is each game turn you get new cards added to your deck. Sure, there are games that have, yeah, add these cards on this turn, you know, 4 or 5 cards. But no, here you start off with a very limited set of cards, and it starts growing. And in fact, that limited set of cards is particularly interesting because all of those cards will be available on the first turn of the game. I think you're allowed to draw 3 cards, and I don't know. The next one, it's 8. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, there's going to be more. So there's like 9 or 10 of these plus maybe the 3 there. So you might end up with a little bit of variance. And as you go further and further in the game, your deck starts to be something more, you know, based on your actual play rather than, because you get rid of cards, rather than just being the fixed set for that date. But at the very beginning, you kind of know what's going to happen. You have a number of different kinds of pieces in the game. Mostly very similar. You have these, which are your basic revolutionary and counter-revolutionaries or whatever, however you want to look at it. You have German units, which are higher quality. You have these Jaegers, which are also white aligned. And for the Reds, their special thing is they've got the armored trains, the little Trotsky invention for the revolutionary period. I don't know if they got used anywhere else outside of, you know, the Russian Civil War, and then of course here too. But stacking in the game. Oh, okay. So when units take damage, they flip over, and they say the Civil and Red Guards, the base units, can only be fully manned when event cards allow for it. I think other units, I'm not sure. Stacking is 3 units in a given space. These are towns. We'll just call them spaces. This applies when reinforcements are placed into the towns, either through cards or at the beginning of turns. You can move through an overstacked space, but you can't be overstacked due to the end of movement or during or after retreats. You got some field fortification markers. And Okay. Different units have some special rules applying to them. The base rules apply to these civil guards and red guard. The armored trains are only allowed to move along, so some of the connections. They're only allowed to move along the railways. Now, you also have these regular road connections. We'll see there's a piece of errata in the draft, but they're just your different connections between territories. And the railways are going to be easier to move along, more infrastructure in place for forces. No more than 2 armored trains in a town, and armored trains do not suffer from supply losses. Okay, so a Jaeger provides you certain advantages if it's involved in an attack towards being able to attack over roads. Normally units are penalized when they attack via roads. If there's a Jaeger involved in the attack, even if it's not attacking over the road, it gets rid of that penalty. Germans have that same capability, but they also penalize the Russians or the red units that are fighting against them. Now, red units get a -2 to attack and defense. If they attack against German units, they get a -1 column shift as well. And, okay, the German units are able to advance even after they've been damaged. And they also do not suffer from supply losses. Control tokens, nothing exciting about them. They're just there. If you don't have units in a space and it's not clear who owns what, you put a control marker down. At the beginning of the game, everything north of the line is white if it doesn't have a control marker on it. Everything south of the line is red. Interestingly, when they describe who owns what, this space is not called out. I'm being particularly picky with this stuff, not, for any reason except that I was asked for that kind of input, and I would note it if it was a complete thing. But I want to catch any errata that they probably will catch it without me, but whatever. Okay. So, like CDGs, you alternate playing cards. Normally, you're going to have a hand of 8 cards on a turn. The exception to that is in January, you only get 3 cards, and that's all there is. So you get all the cards, and both people should know what the other person has. In the February turn, the red player gets one of their cards automatically. The armored trains arrive. They don't necessarily have to play it for the event, but if that does what I think it does, there may be a problem with it, which is that there probably should be a rule saying that, I'm having trouble reading these because of the font. My poor eyes. There we go. Armored trains arrive. Yeah. Nope. This just gives them a pile of trains for a very good, powerful card. So what I thought is maybe the trains couldn't happen if that didn't come, because you get trains as reinforcements as well. But that doesn't seem to be the case, so I think we're okay. And in April, the white player likewise gets this German units land in Finland and 7 other cards from their draw deck. You'll play the cards one at a time, making a choice between whether you want to get the action points or operations points from them, or if you want to trigger the event. If you trigger the event, you don't get the points. If you trigger the event and it has an asterisk on it, the card's removed from the game. So this is like in many CDGs where you have this kind of option. Hey, do you want to play this armored trains card? First of all, you're giving up a big 5-point actions, but also you're removing it from your deck. And the way the deck works in this, that could be a bigger deal than it is in most of these games. There may be a little bit more deck management in this game, just in the sense that your deck's going to be fairly small and you're reshuffling it fairly regularly. Okay. So anyway, if it doesn't have an asterisk, or if you play it for points, you get to put it in your discard pile and it can come up again. Some of the cards are played on the table, and then they are triggered for use later in the game. They just have kind of a persistent effect until they're used or whatever. They're waiting out there. Okay, so the number on the card, unlike most CDGs, you don't have a lot of options here. If you're using it for operations, it gives you one thing. It gives you a number of towns which you can activate, and the stacks in those towns or the pieces in those towns can move and fight. And no matter what, if you played it for action points, it goes back in the deck or in the discard. When a new round begins, the wording here I have to be careful with to make sure I understand it. Both players add that month's cards to their reshuffle deck, and then they shuffle the reshuffle and the remaining cards. So you're going to have a reshuffle every turn, right? So like I said, the card management, the deck management could be very big here, because you can't like count on, yeah, you know, I'll only see that at most once more. No, you might see it every turn if you keep it in the deck. Movement. Okay, the units have two values on them. They have a combat strength and a movement strength, movement value. And the movement's the number of movement points they have. Movement's fairly simple here. Roads, here's where the typo is, and they pointed this out to me ahead of time. They caught it. Roads cost 2 movement points each. Railways only cost 1. I should correct that in my book, but you can move through towns that the other player controls but don't have units in it, and you flip the control. You put a control marker in there or whatever, if it's ambiguous. Armored trains are only allowed to move along the railways. You can't move into the enemies, an enemy unit. You have to attack it instead. And you can't move into a town and stop if you would end up in an overstacked situation by doing that. You can move through it though, which I already explained. You can't move into Russia. All right. So for combat, you announce where you want to attack with units that you've activated, and you probably have to kind of tilt your units or something to indicate what's activated, or use some other form of marking that. There's, you know, I don't have, maybe they might add this. I have a few blank pieces, you could use those for that, to mark which units you've activated. But the attacker names which units will attack which town. Each town can only be attacked once. And you're going to add up your combat strength. And you look to see, so for example, attacking unit battle table, you count up your combat strength. You look to see which one of these tables applies. You roll a die, and you'll do that many hits. We have very, very tiny print here too. I'm wondering if the map might, the map seems kind of small. I like that, but it seems a little tight for these, and especially for these guys. But I do like the size of the map. The only problem is this little space. This is very, very tiny writing that old eyes have trouble with. Doesn't really help that it's in 2 languages. Maybe give it in Finnish and have an English overlay or something. I don't know. Okay. So the asterisk means the losses, at least one of them has to be taken from a special unit, like Germans or Jaegers or trains. Okay, and there's some modifiers listed here. If you attack via a road, you lose 2 from the attacking die roll. unless there's Jaegers or Germans involved in the attack. The red player loses 2 from the die roll if they're attacking against Germans. When the red player attacks against German units, they get a -1 column shift in the weaker column to a weaker column. So not only do they lose from the dice, they also lose a column. Field fortifications give a -1 column shift, and the defender a +1 column shift. And then cards might have an effect. Now, that chart seems slightly at odds, if I'm not mistaken, with this. Any red units that fight against a German unit get -2 to their attack and defense rolls. Let me see if it subtracts 2 as an attacker and a defender. Okay, no, that's just me not remembering or not reading that properly. So that's okay. Oh, where are we? Okay. So you get an amount of hits that you apply to the enemy. They take them in steps. Each unit has up to 2 steps. If it is already on its reverse side, it only has 1 step remaining. If let's see. If the attacker caused at least 1 more damage point than the defender did, the defender must withdraw and retreat. However, if it's a strategic town or a field fortification, the attacker has to beat the defender by 2 hits. If the defender does withdraw or all their units are destroyed, the attacker is allowed to advance, but only with fully manned units, i.e. 2-step units. German units are an exception to that. They're allowed to advance even if they're at half strength. And then you can go to the next battle. And each unit can only attack once. Each town can only be attacked once. I'm not sure what a battle is fought until it's completed. I mean, this is the whole sequence. It gives an implication that, you know, maybe there are rounds of battle or something that don't appear to be. Lots of examples here. Defender has to take his damage first. We got the die roll modifiers. We already hit them off the chart. They're readable there. One thing that would be useful, they've got this card, it's the setup and reinforcements. Maybe put the battle information on the opposite side of these. I don't know what their printing capabilities are going to be. Again, you know, just as a matter of this is tough, at least on this old person's eyes. Okay, if the defender can't withdraw from combat, either because of stacking limitations or being surrounded and pushed against a corner or something like that, their units surrender because they can't retreat. Defender never advances. Field fortifications. Doesn't say any way that they happen. I assume additional ones come into play via cards. Supplies. Okay, at the end of each month, the players check a unit supply line. Town and all units stationed in it get supplies if they can trace to one of your strategic towns, which are these little boops, either by road or rail. If you don't have supply to a town and you don't have any units in it, the town surrenders and goes to the other side. I could see where that's, let's see. Okay, this is not well spelled out. So the supply line doesn't state what you can trace through. It just says they receive the supplies if it's connected. Now, maybe I'm missing something. Because, and this is a pretty major something, I'm looking to see, is this supply here? No. I don't see where I'm allowed to trace supply. Now, I can make some assumptions here, right? I mean, obviously I can trace it through territories I own and territories where I have pieces. The question comes down to, can I trace it through enemy-controlled spaces that don't have pieces in it? Because if that's the case, then the timing of these surrenders becomes important. I am going to assume that you can trace through empty spaces. Let me take a little pause here, because now I can load my files better than I used to be able to, and look to see if maybe somewhere else in the rules it gives some specification as to tracing supply lines that is not here in the supply section. Like I said, they made these rules very, very sparse. They're actually pretty complete for how small they are, you know, when you consider what the game is, right? You know, it's certainly a simpler game than Paths of Glory, but even so, yeah, it's a joy to see such sparse rules comparatively. But sparse isn't good if they end up missing key concepts. Yeah, that seems to be missing. Now, if I do a little thought experiment here, if supply is blocked by enemy-controlled spaces, I have to worry, like I said, about the timing of when these flips happen, right? So I'm going to say that you can trace supply through any unoccupied space and through spaces occupied by your own forces, even if the unoccupied space is controlled by the enemy. I could give you a quick example of why you have to do it in that order. Let me try to think. These little blue areas are the areas with anchors, which are ports, and those might be of some importance for something. But let's see if I can think of it. So that's not a supply center. I was expecting that to be one. So Helsinki's a supply space, right? Let's say the whites own this. Helsinki's red. The reds own this. Let's just take a simple line, and let's say there's supply up above that, right? So these two would be empty. If you can't trace through them, they would, whichever one is done first would flip. Now you could do it simultaneously, but that would feel kind of weird. On the other hand, if they're all empty, that's what would happen. If they're all empty and you can trace through empty, then they would maintain control of those areas, so you wouldn't have anything flip. I don't think that's too big a deal, and we'll see why in a moment, because control of the spaces doesn't seem to be too terribly important, right? You move through them, control changes. The fact that it's not too important may be why you need it, may be an indication that you should only be able to trace supply through your own spaces, but the rules are not in place to support that kind of dual flipping situation to determine which order is done there. So I think that becomes an issue. Of course, you could have both flipping at the same time, but I don't know. Anyway, more importantly is spaces with units in them. If there's fully manned units in them, they get flipped over and lose a step, each of the fully manned units. Partially manned units will remain effective insofar as they are effective at partial manning. They're not going to be affected by the supply. And of course, certain units, the Germans, the armored trains, don't get affected by supply either. Firewood was available everywhere. Okay, reinforcements. Each month you're going to get reinforcements. They're listed here. And by the month, some of them are fixed, like, hey, you get a Jaeger. But some of them are based on your positioning. So 3 times the number of strategic towns that the player has. Same with red, 4 times the number of strategic towns the player has. The Jaegers are going to have to be placed in specific places. Here. And remember, stacking limitations apply when you drop your piece for reinforcements. Now, I'm getting kind of worried about this supply thing because honestly, control of spaces doesn't make a damn bit of difference if supply isn't being affected by that control. And how big a deal is it if we do that mutual switch? I mean, we're looking at this kind of situation, right? Let's just look at this line right here. Red, if this is originally owned by white, this is originally owned by red, right? And let's say red's got supplies coming from here, fine. This space is not supplied because this is in the way. This space is not supplied because this is in the way. So these would just swap, and that might make sense. The other option, and if all supply is assessed at once, that would kind of make sense, and then units that are out of supply might have, you know, would be assessed at that same time. The other option is these would stay where they are because, hey, red can trace through the empty space, white can trace through the empty space. Well, if that's the case, control of the spaces doesn't actually do anything in the game. So I'm beginning to lean towards what happens is these two both flip in that circumstance. I think it's going to be fairly rare that this happens, that you get to this kind of silly situation. Ooh, this guy's in trouble. But he's tiny, so it doesn't matter much. All right, what about victory conditions? Okay, if Vasa ever falls, the Reds win at the end of a white player turn. Now, this is a terminology thing. I've been calling these turns, these are rounds. Turns is the play of a card. So if white loses Vasa, they have to retake it on their next card play, or the game is over. Any red player turn by the end of April, if the white player has 4 strategic towns, they win the game. Now I've got to kind of pay attention to where these strategic towns are. Again, because of the size, they're kind of hard to see. So there's one, that's 2, 3. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. Well, there have to be 4, or else there actually have to be 5. There's 1, that's 4. We've got a list of them. I don't know if that'll help much. Helsinki, Viipuri, down here to Tampere, 3, Vasa, 4, and Oulu, 5. Okay. So if you can drop the reds down to 1, if the whites can grab 4 of those, then the red player has one card play to regain one of them. If the game makes it all the way to the end, into May, the white player has to control all 5 strategic towns. I don't think they can win midway through the turn or the round. They have to make it all the way through. And if the reds are able to hold even a single one at the end of the game, they've won the game. Okay, so we should have, I guess a couple of things that we take from the rules takeaway is, well, 2 things that I'm getting from here. One is, I think these strategic towns have to jump out a little better than they do. They're kind of hard to see. Yes, they're in a bolder print, and yes, the little triangles show a little bit of a space so that you can kind of see them, but I don't think they're jumping out quite enough. Might be a little less attractive if they were jumping out more, but they are pretty important. Maybe a different color font rather than just dark, maybe in red or something, because they were already using a red tone on the map. I'm not sure, but something should make them stand out a little better. And then the other is that supply roll has to be nailed down a little bit better. But honestly, you know, nice short little set of rules for a CDG. I don't think I've seen one like this. Now, it has things that it doesn't have to deal with. You're not having to do all kind of multiple actions off given cards, and you're not having to it's not handling any kind of interception type actions like say Wilderness War has. So, some of the other flavors of the CDGs allow interceptions and retreats before combat and all that. That's not here, which makes sense given the World War I-ish time, although honestly the forces are a little bit more mobile here than, you know, than the traditional World War I situation, simply because the forces are smaller over the amount of area that they're covering. So interception and withdrawals might make more sense in this kind of circumstance. All right, we'll give this a shot and see how it plays out.